Okay, so can I go? Or...
Yes.
Okay, good morning, ladies and gents. Thank you for joining us for part two of this very important conversation. My name is Mandis Majavu. I'm a lecturer at Rhodes in the Department of Political and International Studies. This is a very important, subject for me, and we do not pretend, to have a final say on this subject. But what we do hope to inspire, is really a novel way of discussing this particular history. Mainstream scholarship in South Africa, often ignores 19th century as if this particular time is irrelevant to the development and the consequence of white racism in South Africa. And it's often treated as if 19th century is some kind of a dress rehearsal to the real thing, whereas actually 19th century was really a racial crucible that produced a unique colonial whiteness, that advocated for really a pathological social order, that fundamentally shaped, the daily pattern of everyday life, of whites in South Africa till today. And so, our speaker today, Professor Christy van der Westhuizen, is going to interrogate this, this history. And the event itself is organized by the Center for Non-Racialism and Democracy at Nelson Mandela University. The names of the organizing team include Simpiwe Mpo, Olutobi, sorry, I forget your surname, Olutobi, and Christy herself. And so Christy's talk today is titled What the Water Brought, Post-Colonial Ghost Stories from Nelson Mandela Bay. Christy is a friend and a colleague, and she's also an associate professor at the Center for Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy at Nelson Mandela University. Her publications include the monographs Sitting Pretty, White Africans, Women in Post-Apartheid South Africa. That book was published by UKZN Press. Her second monograph is titled White Power, The Rise and Fall of the National Party, and that book was published by Zebra Press. Christy's research areas include identity, difference, ideology, discourse, and democracy. Christy has held associateships with various universities, including the University of Cape Town, and has previously worked as an associate professor of sociology at the University of Pretoria. So what we're going to do this morning is, we're going to give Christy an opportunity for her to speak for about 35 minutes. Thereafter, I'm going to open up the floor to questions, comments. Please send your questions or comments. If you are viewing this through YouTube, you can send it via YouTube or Facebook, or you can send your message or your question, via the Zoom chat itself. Christy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mandisi. And thanks to everybody for tuning in this morning. I do think we are a bit zoomed out after 7 months of lockdown. So I do appreciate that you have taken the time to be with us today and to engage on this important question. I'm going to share, do some share screening because I've got a visual presentation that I want to share with all of you. I hope that's coming through loud and clear. All right. So without further ado, this paper contains some sketchy reflections on socio-political discourses circulating in a coastal city haunted by its origin as an outpost of the British Empire. The city in question, of course, is Nelson Mandela Bay, with a particular focus on Port Elizabeth, which British Governor Major General Rufain Donkin named after his wife. This will come as a surprise to some people. After his wife, who was one of the ghosts in this tale, as she had died in India, and the naming was done when the foundation stone of a hotel was laid in the Barkens Valley in 1820. This naming already draws together the strings of empire, militarization, and commerce. The reflections in this paper were sparked by a fact-finding tour to explore the causal factors of the environmental degradation of water sources in Nelson Mandela Bay. This tributaries pilgrimage, as it was called, was arranged by the South African Research Chair in Identities and Social Cohesion in Africa at Nelson Mandela University, Professor Andrea Hurst, who is also the co-host of today's webinar. Thank you also to my colleague, Dr. Mandisi Majawu from Rhodes' Department of Political and International Studies, who presented part 1 of 1820 Unsettled, this webinar series. You can watch that part 1 on CANRAD's YouTube page, YouTube channel rather, and our Facebook page. I will start by briefly sharing the theoretical framing of this paper with reference to the concept of ontology. Then I will reflect on how Port Elizabeth was forged from war profiteering. The last section will home in on what the water brought and the consequent ghost stories that are swirling across this post-colonial landscape. The paper seeks to visualize some of the spectres and phantoms that have come to shapeshift across these spaces and structures, recirculating and reimplanting colonial truths and realities, particularly also to prop up post-apartheid whiteness. So looking at the theoretical framing, the idea of ghosts haunting us got me to do some further reading, and I came across this very fascinating concept of ontology, which, and I will be deriving some insights from Colin Davis's reflections specifically on ontology. Ontology comes from Derrida, and as you can hear, it's a wordplay on ontology. It replaces, as Davis says, the priority of being and presence with the figure of the ghost, as that is, which is neither present nor absent, neither dead nor alive. Two forms of ontology is identified by Davis. For Derrida, it is an attempt to grasp otherness beyond knowledge. The spectre is not to be known, but rather opens a door on meaning, which reminds us of the insufficiency of what we know about the present. Therefore, Davis points out that conversing with spectres is not undertaken in the expectation that they will reveal some secret, shameful or otherwise. Rather, it is about opening us to the experience of secrecy as such, an essential unknowing which underlies and may undermine what we think we know. This might be taken as far as Wolfries, who places the spectral at the heart of any narrative of the modern, and suggests that to tell a story is always to invoke ghosts, to open a space through which something other returns, so that all stories are more or less ghost stories. Davis contrasts Derrida's spectre with Abraham and Torok's phantom, the two authors from whom Derrida derived the idea of ontology. But there is a significant difference from his meaning, as their phantom is, quote, the presence of a dead ancestor in the living ego, still intent on preventing its traumatic and usually shameful secrets from coming to light, close it, quote. Therefore, their phantom is also not about revealing a secret about the past to set the record straight, but is instead, in this case, a liar, intent on further obfuscating the encrypted, unspeakable secrets of past generations, and therefore to mislead the haunted subject. For Abraham and Torok, part of confronting intergenerational trauma is to expose these secrets. For the analysis in this paper, I would like to borrow aspects of both interpretations. Firstly, Derrida's approach to recognizing the spectre as an alert to the limits of what we know. And secondly, Abraham and Torok's distrust of the phantom and their encouragement to interrogate the phantom to cut through the deceit, shame, and prohibition. Turning to remembrance in Port Elizabeth, the origin of what was first known as Elizabeth Town, or called by some residents as Little Bess, and then as Port Elizabeth, and which is now part of Nelson Mandela Bay, reflects colonial aims and concerns. It sprung from the interlocked settler methods of military violence and trade. The Dutch Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie set up beacons at the Swartkots River and the Sak River, now Shark River in Happy Valley, around 1752. After the British took control of the Cape Colony, they built a military blockhouse and later a garrison on the edge of what became known as the Barkens Valley to safeguard Algoa Bay from French attack in the early 1800s. The settlement expanded first due to local trade with farmers, providing provisions to the garrison, and then long-distance trade, first of agriculture and then of minerals. The colonial urban landscape was formed, among others, by the ideology of capitalism. While the British are regarded by some as the greatest imperial creators of towns, according to Robert Home, during their 2 centuries of global expansion, the traders and chartered companies, for the traders and chartered companies such as the East India Company, they were little concerned with the physical shaping of colonial ports and towns, other than through private displays of wealth. The extractive drive of colonial capitalism, as seen in the external orientation of European-built railways across the African continent and perfected by the British, physically shaped the early settlement, revealing its focus and disposition towards Britain. The settlers did not live next to the sea, but on elevated land a few kilometers away from the coastline, from where incoming ships and whales could be spotted. The whales were harpooned and slaughtered on the beach, and the ships were offloaded to get provisions for the settlement, and also collected commodities to be transported across the empire. The history of the founding and expansion of Port Elizabeth is the history of the violence of settler colonialism against the people who were living here and against the land and its water masses, on which industrial type and scale of violence was unleashed against any animal from which a profit could be made. The ecological degradation which went hand in hand with the onslaught against the people of this place has been written about poignantly by Jacqueline Koch in her biography of the nearby Kobe River. This devastation is not how it is presented, however, in either settler historiography over time or even in popular discourses today. On the pilgrimage, a tourism discourse was encountered, consisting in part of popular lore in the form of ghost stories. Given my work over the past many years on colonial apartheid and post-apartheid whiteness, this piqued my interest in the continuing presentness of the positive mythologization of the 1820 settlers, which still gives rise to the proud pronunciation of "I am a direct descendant of the British settlers here in Port Elizabeth," as I have encountered twice since moving here last year. Compelling work has been done on memory and history in relation to the constitution of contemporary identities by the likes of Samuelson, Stevens Duncan, and Hook, and others. As Pumla Kola has written in her study on post-colonial slave memory, quote, "Uncovering memory and history demands a critical attentiveness to the uses of the past to negotiate positions in the present." Close the quote. In constructions of post-colonial whiteness, particularly Afrikaner identity is doing some fancy footwork in attempts to rehabilitate itself, as I've written in my book, Sitting Pretty. When it comes to lineage, we've seen a sudden avowal of a so-called mixed-race ancestry by Afrikaners, claiming Krutua as a stammoeder or ancestral mother. This is analysed by Kola and others as an attempt to gain validity in the post-apartheid era in a move that could be anathema to white supremacism, but in fact attempts a whitewashing of the settler violences done to Krutua herself, to the Khoi and to enslaved people, and to all indigenous people in the colonial formation of South Africa. White English-speaking South Africans, or Wesas, if we use the shorthand in the literature, claiming an 1820 lineage is not new, however. With this claiming, there does not seem, on the face of it, to be any adjustment from previous white pride in the empire before and during apartheid, despite it being almost 30 years into the attempt to democratize this country. Premesh Lalu has observed that at the core of the narratives of empire, the imaginary structure of colonial rule conveyed a sense of contradictory impulse. Much of this impulse was a product of attempts to justify acts of violence. My colleague Dr. Majavu spoke last week very powerfully about the racist chaos that was unleashed after the 1820 arrival of the British against the San, the Khoi, and Xhosa. with the wars of dispossession turning what is today the Eastern Cape into a chamber of horrors, as he aptly named it. A savage violence was perpetrated by the British against the people they encountered here. Therefore, some of the dead haunting this landscape are the well-known figures of anti-colonial resistance, such as Tinsa, Wakanda, and so forth. In a city dotted by very noticeable graveyards, one is also reminded of those not well-known, not captured in the archive, the so-called ordinary, who also suffered the everyday micro-injustices, springing from the macro-injustice that one can read off the layout of the graveyards. As A.J. Christopher writes, the African population was segregated into separate graveyards for virtually the entire history of the settlement, whereas the other communities shared cemeteries, but generally occupied separate blocks until the 1950s. Thereafter, segregation became almost total in terms of apartheid legislation. As Lesman Loubser remarks in relation to the Apartheid Archive Project, but it also applies more generally, whereas extraordinary stories of apartheid have been told, ordinary stories have not to the extent that needs be, and by doing so, by telling those ordinary stories, the ghost of every man and every woman can finally be heard, noted, and acknowledged, such that wrongs can be righted in remembrance and injustice corrected in the historical redemption of time and the testamentary. Close the quote there. So, moving just to the role of trade and war in the constitution of the settlement. I had a look at some colonial apartheid and post-apartheid texts that were aimed at popular audiences as part of finding stories through which to make sense of the disconcerting contemporary claiming of 1820 settler lineage in the context of this particular landscape, haunted as it is by the ravages of settler colonialism. The injustice feeding the restlessness of the dead is continued by present-day erasures. Premash Lalu argues that the work of settler historiography is not merely categorical, but also conceptual. And he discerns the seamless linking of property, justice, and progress as indispensable to colonial hegemony. This equivalence of property, justice, and progress can be found in many of the one could say hagiographical texts that have been written on Port Elizabeth over the past how many decades. And I will be drawing on some of them as I go on. There's the book by J.J. Redgrave called Port Elizabeth in Bygone Days, published in 1947. And I will be drawing quite a bit on this book to try and make sense of this particular identity. He asserts that the landing of the British settlers in 1820 was the greatest event in the region's history. The challenge at hand, according to Redgrave, was the problem of establishing in a savage country the rudiments of civilization where before there had been none. This obstacle that he then identifies, and he identifies that as being the so-called natives, he describes with an unabashed white supremacist tone and words. He says it was the wandering gangs of marauding natives who comported themselves as the lords of the country. The aggressive insolence of the natives rose to unprecedented violent action. According to him, that is what led to the founding of Port Elizabeth, which basically started with a permanent military post, as I mentioned, in the form of a blockhouse. It had 2 6-pounder cannons. There were also 2 guard ships anchored in the bay to serve the fort with ammunition. Later on, a stronger fort was created, hence Fort Frederick, which is still standing. This name refers actually to the Duke of York back in Britain. The garrison ultimately held 300 men and magazines for military stores and so forth. Thus, the settlement was first constituted with the technologies of colonial conquest. The first European trader who became wealthy in the region was Frederick Corsten, whose name has been preserved as that of Corsten Township. He serves as an early illustration of the confluence of settler extraction and military power. From 1811, he was supplying the garrison and he was trading with passing ships in salted beef, cattle, sheep, fisheries, and seals. particularly military ships, and he was supplying the British garrison in Mauritius. He killed as many as 14,000 seals in one year, and he sold the skins. He also ran a lucrative business out of killing whales and owned as many as 13 vessels that moved up and down the Swartkops and the Balkans River. By 1836, the city or the settlement was designated to be a free warehousing port by which all goods, wares, and merchandise were to be exported and imported into the colony. Redgrave writes that as the wars against the Xhosa intensified, the port became a base for the conveyance of troops and stores en route to the frontier, thus giving enterprising merchants an opportunity to open large stores and warehouses. Profit drove the wars against the Xhosa. As Koch writes in her book, a self-aggrandizing settler elite promoted the militarization of the frontier, benefited from it, and wanted a long-term, large-scale military commitment to the frontier as the basis for economic development and accumulation. So despite Holmes' discourses swirling around two sites that were visited on the pilgrimage, the first is the Swartkops estuary from Red House to Amsterdam Hook, and the second is the Cape Recife Lighthouse. Sedimented histories reveal themselves through the colonial lore and nostalgia that these places invoke. Looking at the Swartkops estuary in the vicinity of Red House, strikingly, the ghosts conjured during the pilgrimage tour did not speak in any way to the historical conditions forming the colonial or post-colonial landscape of Port Elizabeth. In many places nowadays, a wasteland which is haunted, pockmarked, and polluted by incessant extractive activity. Phantoms with their selective memorialization raise the question of what is submerged in popular depictions today. And that is why I did a scan of popular tourism depictions of the city and its surrounds, and came across the quotation which forms the introduction to the abstract, which is taken from the South African Venues website, and which was on in 2019, and I'm sure it's still on. And basically it says there, life on the Swartkops River is such that the sea needn't feature in your holiday. The constant call of birds, river sailing and boating, swimming, skiing, and river cruises mean that days easily slide into a happy, water-filled existence. But if living the colonial lifestyle in Red House becomes a little tedious, then Amsterdam Hook is a wonderful place to catch a magnificent sunset, drink in hand. Why such a representation that flies in the face of facts? As a study by a colleague, Professor Janine Adams, who also did a presentation as part of the pilgrimage, has shown overloaded and poorly maintained wastewater treatment works, polluted stormwater runoff, and solid waste have all contributed to the deterioration in the water quality of the river and estuary. The deterioration in water quality has affected recreation, for example, the relocation of the Red House River Mile swimming event elsewhere because of high fecal coliform bacteria counts in the water. The contemporary ecological crisis of the Swartkops is a consequence of multiple and mutually reinforcing social and political crises. But sanitation and access to water has been a problem from the earliest settler period. In the 1840s, the settler village was described as not over clean, and that the one long street was encumbered with rubbish of every description. The town was exceedingly dirty and ill-kept, and sanitation was at its lowest. The streets were reeking with filth and household refuse thrown there by the residents. The settlers had a fraught relationship with water. But back to the South African Venues misrepresentation of the Swartkops. Rather than marketing, one can read the text, or perhaps it's in the guise of marketing. The text is a nostalgic invocation that seeks to reassert whiteness in the present with its brazen celebration of its version of the colonial lifestyle. It harks back to the water sports held on the river as a popular settler pastime, starting with sailing competitions in the bay on the British Queen's birthday, Queen Victoria. By 1960, the city's publicity was describing the Zwartkops as the venue of important regattas, where rowing men, sailing and motorboat crews, representative of all parts of the Union, battle for supremacy. These representative crews were, of course, only constituted through white men, by white men. The Zwartkops has gone from healing waters to toxic waters. There's a fluctuating tide of trash and toxic effluent that pollutes the river from the moment it emerges from the Groendal Nature Reserve outside of Uitenhage. The surrounds of the river and estuary consist in large part of an industrial wasteland marked by apartheid geographies. Even the treatment of human waste remains to some extent racially segregated. The city's continuing racial division is demonstrated by racially differentiated human interactions with the river and estuary. Apart from the water sports, which have since been moved to the Sundays River, mineral baths were created accidentally in 1909 while drilling for oil. A hotel was built over the gushing waters, and invalids, so-called invalids and others from across the Union and farther afield visited the hotel. Of course, not the majority of South Africans. By 1960, people were still gathering at the site due to the fame of the waters and the efficacy in treatment of various ailments. It has since been closed. Today, a number of sites, I think I've fallen behind a little bit here. Okay, today, a number of sites are used for cultural ceremonies by traditional leaders, healers, but the water quality is now so poor that participants mention that they cannot drink from the water during their cleansing ceremonies and depend on tap water carried to the sites. Moving to the Cape Recife lighthouse. In Virginia Woolf's To the lighthouse becomes a central image for the synthesis of perspective, bridging as it does the far and the near, the seen and the unseen worlds. It is perhaps for this reason that this was the site on the pilgrimage where ghosts were pertinently conjured, but notably not as a bridge between worlds, whether between the dead and living or between only the living. The arrival of parties of British settlers increased the sea traffic to Algoa Bay. Many a ship was wrecked in that area around where the lighthouse is today. The rock upon which Cape Recife lighthouse was built was named after the then governor of the Cape Colony, Benjamin de Urban. This is now the rock, not the actual lighthouse, curiously. During his visit in 1835, great fanfare was made to convince de Urban of the need for a lighthouse, and a party was held on the rock. The lighthouse was finally completed in 1851. According to a story imparted by a local guide to us on the pilgrimage, the lighthouse was built by slaves. Upon being questioned about these facts, he remained adamant. My research shows that as the decision to build the lighthouse was only agreed on by 1837 and the structure itself only constructed in 1851, it would not have been possible for slaves to have built it. Slavery was abolished in all British territories in 1833 and in the Cape Colony with effect from 1838. This is not to say that it was not built by some other form of unfree labour, given the British and other settler practice of indenturing labour and the system of inboekelingskap. But the person who got the building contract, who was the son of the civil engineer for the colony, one Pilkington, could not have used slaves as the builders. But why does this figure of the slave reappear almost 200 years after the abolition of slavery, and also in a region that was sparsely populated by settlers before the abolition, and therefore had a less significant presence of slaves, unlike Cape Town? Drawing on ontology, is this a phantom seeking to mislead us, or is it a spectre hinting at possible understandings beyond our knowledge? Kola points out that unremembering slavery, which is her term for a calculated act of exclusion and erasure, is about destroying the links between slavery and current expressions of gendered and raced identities. I want to suggest here that misremembering serves a similar function, particularly in relation to contemporary white patriarchal identities. The first reason why the slave reappears in misremembered form 200 years later is because the slave as a human being reduced to property is rendered without a will and is hence made available to be signified whichever way a discourse demands. With this simple but serious misattribution of labor, let us use the opportunity to peek behind the deceitful phantom summoned at the lighthouse at the other haunted and haunting presences. Forgotten but actual labor found in Redgrave's homage to colonial Port Elizabeth links to the trade in which the originating settler Corsten was involved in. Corsten's first contract from the British were for 3,000 barrels of salted beef, which gives an idea of the amount of backbreaking labor that was involved, literally backbreaking. The natives would be carrying barrels of salt fish and beef, bags of salt, kegs of butter, hides, skins, and colonialists, wading through the waves to and from between the beach and surf boats. Passengers and goods were landed, says Redgrave, by means of surf boats, and thence on the backs or in the arms of sturdy natives and landed on the sandy beach. The first jetty was only built in 1837, so this went on for a number of years. Redgrave admits that this primitive method was frequently attended with mishaps. A publicity brochure for the city celebrating its centenary in 1960 provides details of these mishaps that Redgrave chooses to omit. Some of the porters were so-called fingos, as the brochure puts it, more accurately called Mfengu people. They would have had to confront the waves that would submerge them in the stormy and tumultuous water, according to the brochure. So these landings were associated with routine drownings of the porters, to the extent that the authorities were happy to report only one person drowned during 1830. In another another example of this, E.K. Lorimer writes in a book entitled Panorama of Port Elizabeth, published in 1971, about a boy's vivid memory of the landing. This is a boy who was part of the settler parties. He said, "We were landed from the ship, first in surf boats and then on men's backs. A Malay carried me ashore. We remained at the Barkens River for a few days, and then the Boer wagon came to take us to our location. Just as we started, the Hottentot driver tried to cross an old road and upset the wagon and all in it. The Dutchman came up and gave him such a thrashing." Looking behind the phantom, we see here exposed the micro-hostilities and the commonplace everyday violences that were constitutive of power relations in the settlement. Conjuring ghosts to only then misremember them and erase the violences and dehumanization works as a kind of a displacement of those ghosts who are still seeking memorialization, still seeking justice in a present-day refusal to remember as a basis for redress. Let us reintroduce the actual slaves that could be found at that time. Gebebe Badaroon tells us about the ambiguous visibility of the Malay slaves. Analyzing landscape paintings of the slave-owning Cape Colony, she writes about the figure of the docile, hard-working Malay slave that was contrasted with the idle or volatile indigenous person. The Malay slave is shown as complicit with the desires of white colonists. It's a figure wielded as part of a domesticating aesthetic to cover up the violence of Cape slave-owning society, according to Badaroon. Her critical description of the pleasing and picturesque visual depiction of Malay slaves can be found in Redgrave's swooning portrayal of Corsten Vale, which is a farm that was owned by the aforementioned Corsten on the banks of the Swartkops River. Redgrave regards this homestead as a site of humane living, despite saying that Corsten owns slaves in plenty, which he mentions in the same breath as cattle in plenty. He describes the place, Craddock Place, as it was called, at the height of its glory. It would have had lofty rooms ablaze with candelabra and oil lamps, in which the gallant uniforms of the staff officers and garrison officers and the ruffled and puffed shirts of the sober civilians glowed warmly in competition with the silks and satins of the ladies. Slaves bustling to and fro, the scent of roses perfuming the soft night air. Immediately after this, in the text, he juxtaposes the scene with one in which the settlers have to hide from the menace in every thicket, with reference to the Xhosa, which he refers to by the K word, and as vengeful barbarians, in stark contrast to the slaves' industrious serving of the settlers. In this way, then, sorry, that was my. Sorry about that. Shows you always have to turn your phone off for these kinds of things. Anyway, so Baudrillard says that what this technique is about is to position the compliant Malay slave as a reassuring presence designating the knowable world. The figure of the slave hints at the danger to the settler that lies beyond this world. Here's Craddock's homestead, Colston's homestead called Craddock Place. And then you can see in this picture that I'd shown you earlier exactly how this works, that what Baudrillard is talking about. In the bottom right-hand corner, we see these placated racialized others as the boundary of settler identity. So the second set of ghosts that were introduced to us during the visit to the lighthouse was a story of a lighthouse keeper and his assistant. They fell to their deaths after getting into a violent fight at the top of the lighthouse about the lighthouse keeper's wife, according to the guide. This would explain the howling around the lighthouse at certain times. Of course, there is no such story in any of the texts that I've consulted. There is quite a bit of record keeping of who was lighthouse keeper when, but no mention of anything else in this line. The conjured ghosts and the phantasmatic violence, which is gendered, of course, are mobilized for the trite production of gender. It was an obvious importation of the Victorian Gothic, a kind of pedestrian Edgar Allan Poe, designed to imprint a certain set of heterogender relations on the contemporary moment. I did find a ghost that was apparently, according to Redgrave, writing in 1947, haunting the settlers at the time. Let's see if she, unfortunately via Redgrave, can tell us what she can tell us about gendered violence and racialization. Again, is this a phantom leading us to fallacy? According to Redgrave, Colston's sprawling homestead had its ghost. Quote, "It was the uneasy spirit of a slave girl done to death most barbarously by a Hottentot lover. Insane with jealousy, one day overpowered her and threw her body into the great oven in the kitchen. Having secured the oven door, he built up a roasting fire and so left her." Close the quote. Redgrave uses the inaccurate word employed to describe how the unnamed so-called slave girl was connected to the household. He goes further to write disingenuously that her deafness had won her the task of dusting the drawing room. One of the ornaments was a piano, which became, quote, "the poor girl's pride." As she dusted its notes, music rippled under her caressing fingers. After her death, on occasion, spirit fingers strayed delicately across the keys. Then asks Redgrave, "Is there any truth in the story? The only assurance is that of a well-known lady, now herself in the spirit world, who more than once solemnly testified to having heard the piano give forth its spectral music in broad daylight." This phantom presented to its haunted subjects is deceitful by design, creating against the contrast between the barbaric, free, coy person and the genteel slave, the latter with the honor of dusting the colonizer's drawing room, which is the nearest she could come to playing the piano. This ghost story is carefully crafted to erase the violence that was constitutive of colonial relations, displacing and erasing the violence of the Colston homestead, built as it was on dead things. It shifts the violence outside, inflicted by the insanely jealous Hottentot, so-called, activating stereotypes of hypersexual and violent black masculinity. Redgrave inadvertently uses the term spectral. Is this so-called slave girl a spectre in the sense of ontology, hinting at the unknown beyond our knowledge? Leswin Loebsch's idea of the spectre as hinting at potentialities beyond the known at that time could perhaps be read into the ghosts of the slave girl, so-called, who, quote, let music ripple under her caressing fingers. And that's, I will conclude on that note and hand back to Mandisi.
Thanks, Christy, for that fascinating presentation. I really enjoyed that. At this point, I'm going to open up the floor to questions, comments. So if you've got a question, please send that through. While people are gathering their thoughts, perhaps I could ask you a question, Christy. I'm just interested. So in this society, so what's the role of white women in this society, and what goals could be learned about their role in this colonial society?
Well, in terms of the ghost stories, we see a white woman peeking out in the story of the so-called slave girl, where the person who testifies to the appearance of the so-called slave girl is indeed what's called by Redgrave a well-known lady, and but that is basically it. Generally, in terms of the text that I was looking at, you really don't get, white women are very much sort of behind the scenes. In my own work, I have written about the fact that one shouldn't mistake the domestication of the white woman, and particularly the white middle class woman, as that she's innocent of the ravages that were perpetrated, particularly during apartheid, which is what I was writing on in Sitting Pretty. The fact of the matter is that the white woman, and particularly the Afrikaner woman, took it upon herself, generally speaking, to reinforce and to inculcate her children into a particular race, gender, and sexual relations inside the home that were racist, homophobic, patriarchal, and so forth. And of course, then in the relationship with we've got an army of black women working as domestic workers in South Africa. So in the relationship with the black woman who works as a domestic worker, those race relations and particular gender relations, and are also inculcated in relation to black women in white households. So the apparent invisibility shouldn't be confused for not actually being active producers. And I must tell you that in the Jackman Cox book, she writes about a particularly disturbing scene where in one of the wars of dispossession, the settler men were basically riding out with what looked like white flags, and on them were basically embroidered the word exterminate. And that actually brings the white woman into that war in a very direct way, that these men were waving around flags that were basically saying exterminate, and they were embroidered by the women. So those are the women and the girls at home sitting and embroidering the word exterminate. And you can see then what is this colonial imagination about, and the kind of it's not just marginalization or suppression or whatever. It's to the point of elimination, a violence that is aimed at elimination.
All right. Okay, so I've got a few questions here. Okay, firstly, you got a lot of compliments. This is a very good, excellent presentation. And there's a question from Nomalanga Mkize. Actually, it's a comment. She says it's a very rich photographic archive, and this reading you give of Port Elizabeth and 1820 settlerism. And then there's a question from Joanne Davis. She says, thank you for this presentation. She has a question around Xhosa, reincarnation, ghosts, particularly Non-Racialism, and others that are dead will arise. She asked, do these ghosts form part of this ontology that you're talking about? So do you want to tackle that question first? About Non-Racialism and ontology?
Well, that's a very good question, and and definitely something that I'll be pursuing, because that's, yeah, I'm at the very beginning stages of this work, and still finding my way. And of course, the prophecies of Nkabuse and the whole notion, because as I recall, there was the idea of white people sort of apparitions from the sea, basically, if I'm recalling correctly. So there's definitely that would definitely be something to look at through the lens of ontology. I think that could be a very productive investigation. Thanks for that.
Right. So there's another question from Olutobi, your colleague. He says, you know, I think he's interested in you shedding a little bit of light on drawing on your research experience. I think he's just talking this. I want you to shed a little bit of light drawing on your research experience and the uniqueness of this theme being explored in comparison to similar post-colonial stories and experiences from other African cities and countries. Did you want to say anything about that? Basically, just your experiences and your reading of history and how you understand maybe similar themes from post-colonial, you know, societies in Africa.
Yeah, well, I don't know the extent to which this has been applied to other post-colonial context on the African continent, but I do think that it could be a useful approach also there. I don't know what Olutobi exactly means by uniqueness of this theme, so I'm not completely clear on the uniqueness point. So maybe if you could add something more for us on the chat. So.
Right. Okay. So maybe we'll do that. So yeah, so far I've got a lot of comments. People recommending in a text, you know, that add to your presentation. So while we're waiting for more questions to come in, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask another question. I mean, I'm just interested, like, in how, you know, your use of Derrida and how do you marry that, you know, with our racialized history, and how do you make that work? I mean, what do you draw out of Derrida that makes you find insight in Derrida and to talk about, you know, our racialized history? How does it bring out, you know, your theoretical framework? How does it bring out, you know that racial dynamic of our history? Because I mean, Derrida is not exactly known for writing or researching on race.
Well, I think what I just found useful here was this notion of, you know, using the idea of specters and phantoms and so on to investigate memories, you know, history, the past, you know, memorialization, remembrance, and so forth. So it was more from that point of view. I think that it's a very fraught terrain in South Africa. We've really not done we haven't done well at all, actually, in terms of making sense of our past also in a more collective way, so that we can, in a sense, also remember things that have been submerged, that have been moved from view, that have been invisibilized, and to work with that, and to arrive at some kind of, I don't know if one will. It sounds perhaps a bit nationalist, and I don't know if it's possible, but to perhaps at least arrive at some kind of collective understanding, even if within that understanding we are still disagreeing about interpretation. But I don't think we've created enough opportunity for ourselves as South Africans to really do that. And the concept of ontology just was for me like a different way to try and get into this question of almost like the spectral presences, the phantom presences that are all around us. And one is very much struck by that when you're in Port Elizabeth, I must say. Whenever I'm driving on that elevated highway past the city centre, and I look at these buildings that some seem older than 100 years, or even 150 years, and in complete dereliction. And you just think of that should be turned into a museum where we try and grapple, particularly with this province's history. This is, you had 100 years of anti-colonial resistance. There's almost not a stone here that doesn't have some blood on it. This is a very, very violent space for a very long time, and I'm also disturbed by the fact that it doesn't register more in kind of mainstream understandings. It's almost like the Eastern Cape has just sort of dropped out of national consciousness, and that is also very worrying. Both from a historical point of view, but of course because of all the real challenges that we face in this region at the moment. So for me, it's just a conceptual tool. I am a bit of a thief, and I beg, steal, and borrow concepts where I can, in order to ultimately support an anti-racist academic project, which is what I'm busy with. So I feel that one should use concepts that can advance that, and particularly a lot of my work is about the disturbing whiteness and ultimately dismantling whiteness. And I use various also post-structuralist methodologies and terms and so on to also advance that. Okay,
good. So I've got a question here regarding Malay slaves in Port Elizabeth. Motala is asking, when did they get here? And maybe how many were they, if you know? And the second question is from Andrea Hurst. I think you sort of touched on this one regarding ontology. She's asking that you elaborate a bit more on that particular concept. I think you touched on that. You can answer that if you want. Do you want to take a third question?
Let me work with those two so far.
Sure.
So it would seem as though, thanks Enver for that question, it would seem as though there were Malay slaves. One of the illustrations that I used actually refers to a settler boy recollecting that he was actually carried by a Malay slave from a boat in the bay to the beach. And it would also seem from the descriptions of Craddock Place that there were Malay slaves there. So of course the number wasn't at the same level. Cape Town is definitely where we found the greatest concentration of Malay slaves, but there were some here, and Corsten himself was a Dutch settler, so he probably arrived here, I would imagine, with Malay slaves. I think the Trakboere generally, from what I understand, were not socioeconomically in a position to really own slaves, but not that they didn't use coercive methods to put Khoi people in a position that could be akin to slavery, in fact. Then Andrea's question about ontology. Well, basically, it is a play on ontology. It is trying to get at a different kind of being, if you can put it that way. As it's explained in the literature, the idea is to look at so-called specters or phantoms or ghosts as neither dead nor alive. So the idea is a different kind of being that's sort of beyond our own understanding. And it's actually just a device, ultimately. I would say it's a conceptual device for us to look differently at our past and to see when, and why I found it useful for this particular study, to see why certain figures suddenly are conjured. And I found it quite interesting to see the figure of the slave emerge in relation to the lighthouse, because of the actual historical timing, in terms of when the lighthouse was constructed. And I just found it very strange, and it disturbed me actually that suddenly the slave as a figure is introduced into that story. And why would the slave be introduced? and that's why it's the idea of ontology for me is quite, or the concept is and the theory behind it is quite powerful, because one can now actually look at that figure and what would be the function today, because ultimately it is about, as Pumakola also writes, it is about seeing how the past is mobilized in relation to today, to construct identities today, to open up certain political possibilities, but also or to close certain political possibilities. So that's why I found it a very just a handy way to try and approach that history.
Okay, thank you. So third question is, what differences ensue once the water brings the actual 1820 settlers? In parentheses, it says more white women for a start. This is from Debbie, by the way. How far do the settlers haunt the history of the 20th century, Port Elizabeth? And does the city see them as more part of a Grahamstown story? Do you want to tackle that? It's a very long question.
Yeah, I think that the settlers from the settlers are generally more associated, of course, with Grahamstown, because that was ultimately what they called Albany, was the previous Zeeveld was basically where they settled themselves. So there's a stronger association, of course, and also memorialization, in Grahamstown. But for me, what's interesting is it doesn't prevent, of course, white English-speaking South Africans living in Port Elizabeth to identify with the 1820 lineage. So I'm sort of interested in trying to understand, and I'll have to do much more work around that, of course, but to try and understand the drawing of that lineage without any kind of sense of shame, I would say, or any kind of problematizing of that. It's seen as a proud legacy that one can proclaim, and that's done by white English speakers in Port Elizabeth itself. So I have to find out more about I'll definitely try and investigate more the idea of British settler identity, particularly in Port Elizabeth. And I would appreciate any suggestions of any authors to read, particularly in relation to Port Elizabeth on this question. Of course, bringing in actual 1820 settlers, yes, more white women, yeah. I think that is part of the bigger project. As I said, these are very sketchy, and I'm really at the beginning of a project.
Yeah. Okay. So, question, actually, it's a comment from Terry Oakley-Smith. He says he's interested in the brief discussion of Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse concept of both near and far. And another comment from Yusuf Adam. He says the element of slavery and its geographical reach is a neglected focal area in the region's history. Do you want to comment on those two comments?
No, we definitely agree with Yusuf that bringing in slavery, but slavery generally, and Puna Kola has also remarked on this in a really excellent book. This is something that's only being rectified now in recent years. Of course, Gabeba Badaroon's wonderful book as well, where we bring in slavery as an important period in our history that had massive ramifications, also in terms of the racist project in this country. And we haven't brought that in enough at all. It would seem as though we're seeing it as somehow not part of the primary, the primary historical narratives of South Africa somehow. But as I say, there's definitely been some work done to rectify these omissions, but much more needs to be done. And I think bringing in the Eastern Cape could be really good work. I mean, that could be fantastic work. In terms of Virginia Woolf, I was just struck by the idea of the lighthouse as this kind of interest, kind of a structure that you can see from afar, and that is supposed to indicate a kind of it's a kind of I think one of those symbols that if you're in a ship in very stormy waters, that's the kind of, to see that light would of course create a sense of hope, a sense of but also a sense of danger. The idea of it as a physical structure being almost like near and far, and and being, and that it communicates over distance, and that it's an essential, it's a communication that can either save life, it can save lives, and so forth. So it's just I just found it an evocative idea, the idea of the lighthouse as a kind of a symbol between seen and unseen worlds, in the sense that it is itself, or I think you can see the light without seeing it. If you can't see the light, if the light for some reason is not working, you can be in mortal danger without realizing, and so forth. There's strong themes of life and death, and of survival or not, and so forth, wrapped in there.
Okay, thank you. So a comment from Joanne Davis. She says she agrees with you regarding Derrida. Ideology resides in the sign, not the sign in ideology. And then there's a question from Patricia. She asks, are museums more important to social benefits, that is, using the buildings for the benefit of community rather than turning them into museums? Do you want to answer
that? Yeah, well, I think one needs to strike a balance. I think that there's definitely more space for us in South Africa to be thinking in this, also the symbolic realm, and how do we signify where we are now and where we want to be, and how do we remember the past, or the pasts? One should perhaps speak of multiple pasts. How do we bring those remembrances in, actually, to make to create a deeper understanding, and also of particularly of these histories of humanization and dehumanization that we have suffered through over the past how many centuries as the people of this region. And so I think that's I feel that is not something that can be cast aside. Of course, we have very pressing socioeconomic issues that we have to address, but at the same time, we can't, human beings, and that's why I'm also somebody who's drawn on Derridian theory, but we construct our worlds through symbols. Ultimately, we construct our we construct ways of being, ultimately through our symbols and our signs. So that's something that is important, and I don't think we've done enough of that. It's interesting with the president's recent announcement that colonial monuments will be shifted and repositioned and so forth. And of course, that's an important project. But at the same time, you want to know what are we doing to actually now create those shared understandings of the past, and how do we bring those colonial monuments perhaps in conversation with that, if at all?
Okay. So we've got a comment that came via Facebook from Selvin, basically just echoing what you said. There's not a stone in the province that doesn't have a blood on it. So that's just just echoing him. And then we've got a question here from Glenn. He asked, do you think there's any connection with what Jonathan Johnson calls knowledge in the blood? And is this a form for ontology? I'm thinking of the strong fear of bodies of water that many people of color carry, and this connection to the type of drownings you drew attention to, also connected to the transatlantic slave trade with slave ships sinking. Any thoughts?
Oh, that's an interesting connection. I haven't actually thought of that at all. Yeah, that's actually a very interesting connection that Glenn Holtzman is making. in terms of the knowledge in the blood as a form of ontology, I don't know if Glenn wants to add a bit more there in terms of how he would see that linkage. It's not immediately obvious to me, I have to admit.
Yeah, maybe he will, add more stuff to it. Okay, so I haven't received any other questions here. Okay, so I don't know if you want to add anything to your presentation, or just clarify something, or just tell us what's next as far as this research is concerned, and before we
yeah, as I said, this is very much the beginning stages of trying to make sense of how these well, in a sense, there's what Kola talks about as unremembering, which I think is a very particular device in the construction of whiteness in post-apartheid South Africa. And I also want to bring in this idea of misremembering more. It's very interesting when you have a complete misrepresentation of something, of something where there are certain historical facts available that can shed light. It was interesting to me that when I came across that South African Venues website marketing text, I was extremely surprised to see the various elements that were brought together in that message around. It's almost like the message was drafted in 1945 or something. It just seemed completely, also because of what it was physically referring to, because what it was physically referring to didn't exist at all, doesn't exist. I mean, it's actually a contemporary text that doesn't exist at all. And of course, then just the very cavalier insertion of the colonial lifestyle. Come here if you want to live the colonial lifestyle. So I'm very interested in these kinds of unrememberings, but also misrememberings, miscastings, and so forth, to try and make sense of the various modes through which whiteness rehabilitates itself in contemporary South Africa, and tries to also hold on to its power and privilege.
Okay, thanks, Christy, for that. We've reached our 20 minutes mark for questions. Thank you, everyone, for your thought-provoking questions. I thought what a fruitful discussion. I really enjoyed that. And I would like to thank once again Christy, for the wonderful presentation, and for organizing, this forum, to have these kind of conversations. And at this stage, I'm going to hand over to Professor Andrea Hurst, for final remarks and vote of thanks. Prof. Andreas, are you ready?
I am. Hi there. Am I muted? Okay, so wow, what an absolutely interesting presentation, and I have the honor and the pleasure of doing a vote of thanks. So I would very much, first of all, like to thank all of the people who helped put this double-part seminar together. Dr. Olutabi Okimbada in the background, who's a postdoc at CANRAD. Sorry, you haven't really seen his face, but he's been very much part of bringing the whole thing together. Simpiwe Zondani, who's an intern. And then, of course, the co-host, co-presenter, Mandisi Majuba, who is part of the political and international studies at Rhodes University too. So thank you everybody for all of the work in putting this thing together. But last and not least at all, it really gives me great pleasure to offer a vote of thanks to Prof. Christy van der Westhuizen for this fascinating reflections on the historical spectres that still haunt some of these iconic sites in Port Elizabeth. So I have to say that I was very happy when she agreed to join us on this third pilgrimage of the Tributaries Project. And it was wonderful to see the creative, reflective process unfold that produced, among other things, this two-part presentation. I recall the first kind of generative spark during our site tour of the Cape Recife Lighthouse, where some of the vagaries, and I have to say the oddities of our guide's talk caught Christie's critical attention. In that moment, there was a kind of a combination of academic critique, like, is our guide's information accurate, or is it biased? Is it adequate? Is it nostalgic? What's going on there? And this unpredictable kind of wacky spark of creative inspiration. Our guide told us this really silly ghost story related to the lighthouse keepers of old. The story was silly, it was eye-rolling, but the metaphor took hold, and haunting became this powerful leitmotif and conceptual lens for Christie's further explorations of the traces of coloniality and whiteness and spatiality in some of these Port Elizabeth sites. So as Christie's demonstrated, Port Elizabeth is a city still haunted by its origin as one of the British Empire's colonial outposts, not only spatially through these strategic military and naval infrastructure, but also in the less tangible residues of violent cultural and ecological colonization. So I'm very much reminded of Paul Kleer's painting of the Angel of History. I mean, the face is turned backwards, or the angel is moving backwards towards the specters of the past, and it is aghast and repulsed. And in relation to that, Derrida's accompanying insight that you must move away from past violation without any grasp of an ideal, non-violent future. So no present person, I think, or culture is free from these ghosts and these specters. Hence the metaphor of ontology is so powerful. I love it. I think that's wonderful. So there's a whole lot to think about. To my mind, this kind of combination of sharp critical thinking and intellectual creativity is what good academic work is all about. And I really want to thank Christie sincerely for sharing her work as it has unfolded and gained depth and momentum, both at the Tributaries Project Colloquium and in its further outflows during these seminars. I think this tributary has become a river in its own right, and I'm imagining a really, really very interesting book project. We'll see how that goes. So thank you so much. I would very much like to just maybe hand back to Mandisi to just say a proper kind of final goodbye. And what we usually do is then just put on your video just so we can see you, and then you can wave and say goodbye. But yes, but thank you. Thank you all. It was a very fascinating seminar.
Thank you, Andrew, for that. Okay, you guys want to switch on your webcams so that we can say bye to everyone? Switch on your webcams. Bye. Bye. Thank you.
Working. Bye.
Thank you for tuning in. Oops. See you next time.
Okay.
Bye, Christy. I'll ring you.
How are you? Okay.
Okay, bye.